Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Associate Professor Alan Pegna. He is a neuropsychologist whose interests lie in the field of cognitive neuroscience and clinical neuropsychology. After receiving a master's degree in psychology from the University of Geneva in Switzerland and a second master's degree in human physiology from University College London, he obtained his PhD from the University of Geneva using brain imaging techniques to study spatial processing in both healthy controls and brain-damaged patients. He worked for over 20 years as a clinical neuropsychologist at Geneva University Hospital and is an academic at the University of Geneva, where he supervises numerous research projects in the field of visual spatial processing, again in healthy participants and in persons with focal brain lesions. He joined University of Queensland in 2015, where he now explores the neural basis of visual and spatial processing of emotional stimuli. More specifically, using EEG, he examines the brain's response to different facial expressions, as well as to faces that vary in their perceived approachability. For example, their apparent trustworthiness or dominance. When possible, these studies are also carried out with brain-damaged individuals in order to investigate the role of particular brain regions in these processes. This is a really fascinating conversation with Associate Professor Alan Pegna, and I would really encourage you to think bit more deeper as to the applications that this holds in terms of our natural biases that are out of our consciousness, that I think is so fascinating in understanding ourselves more and also about how we relate with others. Enjoy the show. Alan, a big thank you for coming onto the show and taking some time out of your busy schedule.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm really excited to talk to you today, particularly about this space of, cognitive neuroscience and, clinical neuropsychology, in particular, your work in the space that most of us, have probably never considered, but is a force, is an act that's occurring for all of us, around how the brain responds, to different facial expressions. It's something that we do from birth in many ways. We're smiling towards children and connecting in that way, and we've all felt what it's like for someone to smile back at us versus to frown versus to maybe not have any facial expression. So excited to have you on the show today.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and again talking to you about this. It's really interesting because it's a topic I'm really passionate about. So ready to discuss any aspect of it with you.
Fantastic. So tell me, how did you get into this space? Where did this passion come from?
Well, that's a good point. I was interested in the brain, I think, practically in high school. I think the first books I read about the brain was when these were things I read when I was in high school, and always wanted to study psychology, and particularly neuropsychology. I was always interested in the way the brain and behavior interacted, what part of our behavior was determined by our neurons, by our biology, if you like. And so, as expected, I studied psychology, I studied neuropsychology, and I did my research and my PhD in that area, and I started working in a hospital. And I think the actual interest I had in facial expressions actually was sparked by a very specific situation I found myself in how long ago was that? That must have been around 15 years ago, I think, where I came across an individual who sadly had a stroke that caused him to lose his ability to see. So he was what we call cortically blind. That means that his retina of both his eyes were intact. His optic nerves were intact. It's just that once the information reached the first processing steps in the brain, at the back of the brain, the first areas that deal with vision, those areas were damaged. So he was, for all intents and purposes, he was blind. Now, what was very surprising, I had this chance finding one day, walking in to the ward to check on him and see if he had improved. I walked into the room, and without really remembering the fact that he couldn't see, I was thinking of something else. I opened the door and he looked up at me, and I smiled at him without saying anything, suddenly realizing, obviously, that I'm smiling at someone who can't see. That doesn't make sense. I have to say something. But before I said anything, he smiled back. And I immediately thought that that something had happened, that he had improved, that he had regained his vision. So I told him, "Oh, well, Mr. So you're looks like you recovered." And he said, "No, why? I can't see. Why are you saying that? It's just as bad as it was yesterday." I said, "Yes, well, I smiled at you and you smiled back. How is that? What happened?" He said, "Well, I don't know. I suppose I kind of thought that anyone who would walk into the room would be smiling, which is why I smiled back." Now, that wasn't an explanation that I found really convincing. So what I did is I tested this experimentally. I put him in front of a computer and I flashed a series of faces with emotional expressions. So smiling faces, angry faces, and so on. And I asked him to tell me what the expression of the face was. Now, he initially just brushed it off. He said, "Well, I can't see. What are you asking me to do?" I said, "Yeah, well, just take a guess then. What do you think? What do you feel? What are your expectations about the face that's appearing on the screen?" And I flashed a series of faces. He said, "Okay, I'll go along with you. I'll do it. But, I'm just guessing."
It almost sounds crazy at this point, right?
It does, yeah.
It's fascinating. It's like, why would you be asking me to do this? But your hunch.
Absolutely.
It's like, let's just have a look.
Absolutely. And it turned out that he was actually guessing above chance. He couldn't see the faces consciously. He wasn't detecting them, but he was able to guess what the expression was. So he wasn't flawless. He wasn't at 100%, but he was just well above chance. If you toss a coin and you get that kind of pattern of response, you know that your coin isn't properly balanced, so to speak.
Just out of curiosity, well above, obviously chance is 50-50. Actually, it's probably even less because it's not just smiling or frowning. It's not two options, right? But was it significantly more than what you would have expected if it was by chance? So
it was. Wow. Again, it wasn't highly. It was perhaps around, off the top of my head, I think it was in the 60 something percent.
Wow.
But the thing is, I didn't even trust the results at first. I did that over and over again. What I did was, on one day, I presented smiling and angry faces and told him, "Can you guess if it's smiling or angry?" And the next day I started again with fearful expressions and happy expressions. And then the next day I started again, sort of went on over several days trying different emotional expressions. And he was always above chance with this task.
Wow.
So there you go. Now the story doesn't really stop there, because at first I thought something is weird. And I'm a clinician, but also a scientist. More of a scientist perhaps today than a clinician, I think. At least I've progressed more towards the research component of my work. So I retested him with other types of stimuli. I retested him with photographs of male and female faces and asked him to guess if it was a man or a woman. But he was a chance. I tried circles and squares. He was a chance. I tried positive scenes and negative scenes, sort of scenes that show very negative things, rubbish and things lying on the ground versus children playing, for example, and asked him to guess if that was positive or negative. but he was also at chance level there. So it was really only the emotions, because when I went back again and then restarted the whole experiment with the emotions, he was again above chance. So it was really something that was that I found systematically.
And is that something that obviously was unique to him because of the type of brain damage and where it was in the occipital lobes? I'm assuming something that affected occipital lobes. Is it something that our emotional facial expression is something that we have a greater connection to versus, circles and squares? Is that retained more, or more likely to be retained than these other things like, a positive or a negative scene, or, whether it's even male or female, but it's more important whether the male or female is smiling versus, where there's a threat or a safety response?
Yeah, I believe so. And there's some evidence that the processing, this kind of automatic processing that occurs without awareness, has to be about relatively either very basic things that we learn to associate with negative situations, or perhaps genetically programmed features, things like spiders and snakes, potentially. Mm-hmm. Now, I have to point out that these findings, so just perhaps one element that I can add to the final element of the puzzle here, is that I still was wondering which part of the brain was responding, because if he is guessing above chance, it does mean that somewhere in his brain, this information is being processed. So what we then did, the last step of that series of experiments, was to then scan his brain while we presented images, photographs of facial expressions and neutral expressions. And we tried to establish which part of the brain was responding to the emotion. So it turned out that what was happening is the amygdala, which is a structure situated in the temporal lobes, so it was on the right in his case, the right amygdala was responding to these emotional expressions, even though the main visual areas at the back of the brain were destroyed. So there was no response there. So somehow we realized that information was coming across from the retina, transiting through a number of relay stations and ending up in the amygdala. Again, that being a structure that processes emotional expressions, but doesn't need awareness. It does that without it actually gaining consciousness.
That clearly there was information because of the intact, retina. Mm-hmm. The eyes are intact, so there's still information coming in. It's just that the occipital lobes are not processing, or maybe they are, but only to a certain level that is not demonstrating vision for the gentleman, or potentially not. Maybe those elements, are something that the amygdala itself can pick up. Wow.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting.
So what happened? What happened next for you? I mean, because obviously that's changed your trajectory. It's like, I've got to look into this more. This is
absolutely,
this is huge.
Absolutely. Yeah, this became really interesting. And again, the reason I emphasize this point is that really sparked for me an interest in emotional expressions, facial expressions, but also in awareness of facial expressions or emotional stimuli. Now, it's hard at this point not to acknowledge the fact that, and I wouldn't want to not acknowledge the fact that there are other researchers who had been working on this in the past, and I had read their work, and I was, of course, fascinated. And I'm thinking about scientists like Beatrice de Gelder or Joseph Ledoux, who had been working on this topic, and who I'd read their work, which is why it gave me the idea of moving forward in these studies. But what I found particularly interesting is that since then, I've been again exploring these aspects of facial emotions, and among the questions that I'm exploring currently, typically, are questions like, what are the stimuli that are processed without awareness? So it's, yes, facial expressions, but is it just an angry face, a happy face, a fearful face? Again, is it a trustworthy face? Would things like that be processed potentially? And what about Joseph Ledoux? He wrote a book called The Emotional Brain, and he already had suggested, and that was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, he suggested that this kind of non-conscious processing would occur for anything that's a threat, and it's an old pathway that's been maintained in the brain that allows us to gain those extra milliseconds when we have to respond to something that's a threat to us. That's, for evolutionary purposes, it makes sense to be able to detect the presence of a snake in the environment without having to go through the more complex processing that would happen through the cortex, where you go, oh, here's something that's got a certain color, it's got a certain shape, it could be a snake. A snake is associated with lots of negative things, danger, and so on and so forth. All that takes a bit of time. Mm-hmm. So it makes sense that we would have a structure like the amygdala that's responding really quickly and really rapidly and causing us to move away from these potentially noxious stimuli. And I think that deserves more investigation.
Yeah. I know a book written by Malcolm Gladwell, and I'm not sure which one it was in particular, but he spoke about an experiment that had participants, flipping cards at random from two decks, and one deck was designed to be high risk, high reward, and the other deck was designed to be low risk, but a little reward over and consistently. Yeah. And the participants were flipping at random, but interestingly, it would take something like 80 cards before they could say, I know why I'm gravitating to this one because it's giving me these results. They could verbalize it, but they could go out and see that they were actually having different unconscious responses like, sweatiness and heart rate and other different things well before those 80 cards where they could verbalize it. So they were demonstrating it at 30 cards or something, if I recall, thereabouts. So there's clearly processing that's occurring before it's conscious to us, before we can go out and say, I know what I'm doing. Like, it's very easy for me to say, I saw that person smile and that's why I smiled back. But this is exactly where it didn't make sense for you, where you said, well, you didn't see me smile. And he said, well, my actions showed I did, which is fascinating. And so it seems like, that factor must be in play, in our lives on a daily basis. And I can only assume there has to be some evolutionary function to that. It's kept us alive or assisted in some way.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah, it's true. I see. I think the study that was referred to there was a study by Antoine Bechara, and Damasio also develops that idea in his book, The Emotional Brain. It's true that there's also.
Did I get that right at least, or thereabouts?
Yeah. That's exactly. Yeah, that's absolutely it. It shows that to a certain extent, at least that's what's been suggested based on experiments such as this so-called gambling task. It suggests that at one point before you're cognitively aware of something, you have this emotional response, and essentially what you're doing is interpreting the emotional response. Well, really simplifying it there, but again, the basic idea is that you kind of develop, based on previous experiences, you have emotional responses to situations, and what happens is then, confronted with new situations, you start to develop these gut feelings, so to speak, and you interpret those gut feelings, and that helps you choose and decide things. It makes a lot of sense, because I like the idea because today we know that emotions are not, this isn't something that you can disconnect from cognition. For a long time, people studied humans as if we were robots and emotions were a kind of separate thing, but it's intertwined, obviously, and our decisions are driven by emotions, and our emotions drive our decisions. So we're one in that sense, as far as emotions and cognition are concerned. Again, which is really interesting, because bringing me back to this very specific situation of how we unconsciously process emotional stimuli. There's a lot going on that we don't think of. And I'd like to give you an example I gave to a student a few weeks ago. It happened to me. I was driving, I was with my wife, I was in the passenger seat. We stop at a traffic light, and I turn around and I look at the car next to me that was slightly ahead of me. So I was slightly to the side and behind the lady who was driving the car. And she'd stopped at the light and she was doing something on her phone at the traffic light. And I was looking at her thinking, oh my gosh, she's taking a risk, because it's a terrible fine if you get caught doing that. And as I'm staring at her, thinking that, suddenly she turns around, and in one single sweep, she turns around and looks straight at me. And this example, lots of people have, and we've been through it a lot of times. That means that this isn't a random occurrence. I suspect there again that in our peripheral field, in our far periphery, we're actually constantly processing information, and things that may be relevant are then going to be brought to our attention. We're going to then shift our attention and go and see what's going on in the field. All that aspect of processing, again, this is all ongoing without our awareness. That lady in the car, she was doing something on her phone. She was focused on whatever she was doing, sending a message or something. Yet at the same time, and I suspect again it's the amygdala that's probably processing information in the peripheral field without it ever reaching consciousness. And at one point, it's a face. It's not just anything. It's my face staring at her. That probably pushed the information into consciousness and then caused her to turn her attention and see who was looking at me like that, who's staring at me. Again, all these things are going on constantly, and we're not aware of it. And I think there's a lot there to explore in what our brain is doing without us knowing, so to speak.
It would be interesting to see if there's research, or to do research which sees whether there's a higher chance of us turning around if someone's looking at us versus if they're not. Because, sometimes we've all felt that experience of like, I'm being watched, or someone's looking at me, or maybe they're critiquing me. And clearly there's plenty of false positives there and so we can have confirmation bias. But to do the science around and go, what's going on there? Because obviously there would be evolutionary advantage to see someone if they're looking at you versus not, and this might be also why we try and learn with I know certain animals or something. It might be don't look at them in the eyes or something. Whether they're fairy tales or not, I don't know. I'm not an animal handler, but we do hear these things about how to react to certain animals, and maybe that says something about how they're wired, and obviously potentially how we're wired. And even fascinating, that story, chances are the amygdala is looking for a police officer, because that's more likely than an oncoming car smashing into him, which is funny. We're kind of like, I'm more likely to get stung $400 and 4 demerit points on my license than I am to have an accident or something, or be aware. So it's quite funny how we behave. At least that's what I'm assuming is happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, surprisingly, that actually I've got some students working on that at the moment. We initially, because the other thing we know is that our vision isn't very precise in the peripheral field. We don't see that. I mean, we're not very good at distinguishing or identifying things in the periphery. So it kind of made me wonder, do we have the ability to detect an emotional expression in the field. Would we be better at detecting an angry face or a neutral face in our peripheral field if it's really in the extreme periphery? And we started running that experiment. It's ongoing, and it turns out that it's not that easy to guess what the emotion is for a face that's really very far in your periphery. But surprisingly, well, no, actually, it isn't surprising. I say unsurprisingly. In fact, we are detecting. We went up to 50 degrees laterally, and people are still practically at 100% able to detect the presence of a face in the environment. It's really surprising. You can go quite far and still detect a face. So again, what might be happening is, I'm guessing here, but what might be happening is that the amount of information processing that's going on in the peripheral field and what the amygdala is doing is really looking at very crude information, very basic things. Maybe at the end of the day, it'll be just about two eyes staring at you and not even
Sure.
and not even a whole face. It would be a more parsimonious explanation, because that would then include animals, for example, potentially whatever, a lion or whatever's staring at you in the periphery. It might be about eyes.
Mm-hmm. How does this work in maybe a obviously we're looking at the peripheral, so that's going to be much more crude. How does it work when we have a full face recognition as we are at the moment? I know that there are elements, particularly something that you've looked at, being trustworthiness, which is probably at the center of all of this, because that's kind of how we relate with one another, and so many social encounters and engagements are around trustworthiness or lack thereof. How does it work in that space? Are there are there micro expressions that are occurring in the background? What are they, if identifiable? Because obviously we all know how to smile, but we've all also I'm assuming others have experienced life the way I have. Sometimes you meet someone and they just look creepy, if I can use that word. You just can't trust them. And I'd hate if that's a false positive, which I'm sure it is, many a time, because our radars probably aren't that good. But there's something that you're repelled by or concerned by. Something's going on. You're like, I don't know, they're not striking me as someone I want to spend a lot of time. And I haven't even spoken to them.
Yeah,
it's
true.
interesting.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, that's quite true. And in fact, it's also because of this type of question that has also come up in my mind, that I also began to be interested in things like facial trustworthiness or dominance, because it's true that we get these impressions, and I was wondering how close they are to, and how similar they are to this processing we have of this non-conscious processing of emotional expressions that we display. And yeah, I think there again, it's quite interesting, because of course there is a fair amount of research that's been carried out, for example, on trustworthiness, how we rate a face of another individual as being trustworthy or not. And there are several different features actually that play a part. What's interesting is one of these features are these characteristics, these facial characteristics, structural characteristics that possibly mimic facial expressions, because what we have is people who have you note that someone who has a mouth that's slightly curved upwards will be generally judged as more trustworthy as someone whose mouth is curled downwards, for example. Same with eyebrows, for example. Eyebrows that tend to go slightly towards a frowning position, when a natural position that would resemble frowning, so slightly V-shaped. These would person with eyebrows would be considered less trustworthy than those who have the downward eyebrows, sort of the kind of shape that you get in a smiling face. So there are a whole lot of features there that seem to be, and there's a researcher in that area called Todorov who did a substantial amount of research there, who suggests that in part, not entirely, but in part, what may be happening is that this trustworthiness judgment is piggybacking on the emotion processing network in the brain. So essentially, it's your emotion processing, the areas that would normally respond to facial expressions that are responding to these micro features, these small structural differences. And this impression of trustworthiness is actually, once again, piggybacking on those information processing networks. But that's not the whole story either, because there are other features that seem to be linked more to hormonal aspects, things like the more male-looking hormones, so brow ridges that sort of stick out, or a square jaw, for example, will be considered less trustworthy than a more pointy chin, these more generally more female traits, let's say. So there are also hormonal aspects that are playing a part. So yeah,
so it's really playing. Obviously, there might be an emphasis in your research and maybe others in terms of that trustworthiness, because that's the logical space to go. But in actual fact, you suspect it's occurring across the board, whether it's dominance, whether it's compassion, whether it's maybe the difference between someone who can be compassionate, empathic, or even sympathetic, and the differences about how people even do this when they're feeling your pain, or they can understand being in your shoes. That there's a likelihood that if the measures were available, we could see some differences as to how we perceive the expression of that. That's in our unconscious, that's kind of pushing our behavior or even our emotions around as to why we relate to others in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's true. Again, this is bidirectional influences there, because I think that we're constantly making decisions. We mentioned this earlier on when talking about the fact that our emotions influence our cognitive processes and vice versa. But there was an interesting study, and I think it relates to what you are just mentioning, what you just mentioned now. It's an interesting study where they showed photographs of persons who were politicians or not, of countries that the participants didn't know of. So basically, they're running it in the country and they're taking photographs of politicians from some country,
Spain or something,
on the other side, exactly, on the other side of the world, that no one's really aware of what's going on. And they got them to try and guess if they thought that person would be a good politician or not. Just showing a photograph, do you think this person could be a good politician or not? And it turns out that there again, people tend to be pretty much above chance. So, which is surprising at first, but then when you think of it, maybe it isn't that surprising, because maybe when you go and vote for a politician, you're actually also, your vote is highly influenced by what the person looks like, by facial characteristics, by micro expressions, and so on and so forth. So yeah, we're probably always doing that.
Our current prime minister has changed his image, very significantly from previously, with regards to his weight in particular, but also his facial appearance and, how he, suits up each day, at least, coming into the election, and how it's discussed. So, I imagine, they're not silly either. Yeah. They understand the value, whether they're going out and doing an actual control study or something like that is probably unlikely, but they're certainly influenced by thinking, of in that same way.
Yeah.
What's interesting about that is I recall reading about that same scenario that you said, where people were given random photos of politicians and a control group, random people, and picking which ones are most likely to be politicians, and above chance that was found to be accessed somehow by humans. I read that a similar thing was done with perpetrators of sexual abuse, and that they were given photos of, and I believe this was done with younger persons. Don't know how the ethics went through and the like, or when it was even done. So I don't know if this is valid or true or not, but it's reminded me of this, and that there was a higher than chance where there were certain photos that were selected more often by who the perpetrator would select to target as a victim, or to approach. And I don't know whether it's valid, and obviously, frightening implications if, we'd all be scared, but it seems to me like it's ringing the same truth, that there is something that we're all, depending on what we're looking for, and maybe that's from a crime, violence, maybe that's how someone cons people, that there's all these influences that are going on, and is that even a possibility, or a likelihood? I suppose, I mean, everything's a possibility, but is it a likelihood that that we're geared to try and select people for what we're trying to do? I mean, I assume in nightclubs we're probably all trying to do that with meeting a partner, sometimes successful or not, but this is obviously a bit more of a scary scenario, but
absolutely, and it would make sense. Obviously, you want to, of course, the idea is not about putting any blame on the victim here or anything, of course. But at the same time, what it may mean, I think, is that perpetrators may be looking for specific traits that we might not be aware of, but it's almost ethological. It's maybe someone who may act, or in this case it was photographs. Are there certain traits that make the perpetrator believe that person would be a potential victim more easily than someone else? I don't know of this study, but perhaps it could. I can see it relating, for example, to dominance. Perhaps there are certain traits that might inhibit a perpetrator thinking, oh, this person feels dominant. Again, we have this judgment. When you show photographs, you can play around with certain traits. For example, again, the jaw, the eyebrows, sort of the shape of the face. And participants who look at these photographs will judge some of these photos as being of people who are more dominant, hierarchically more dominant personalities, for example. So I can see that tying in this kind of way. The problem is, and there's a history for that also that dates way back to the study of criminology. Of course, these characteristics now don't necessarily reflect what the person is. So it's not because someone has dominant traits that person is dominant. And the error comes from then trying to believe that there is a parallelism between the physical features or the facial features and the actual person's character. Obviously, that doesn't equate.
But that does make sense, because the dominance factor, would, I'm assuming, play out in that scenario, and particularly around, for example, if someone might be timid, they might be maybe potentially more susceptible to grooming over time, that someone could then obviously exploit. But it is interesting, because the same thing would be true if someone felt that I had a characteristic of being impulsive or something like that, where if they continue to try and sell me something higher than average, so if they thought that someone is less impulsive and I'm more impulsive, I will potentially get more opportunities to buy something because I'll be offered more times. So it might look as though I'm buying more, but in actual fact, there is, other factors that could account for some of that variance, that anyone with lots and lots of marketing or lots of approaches is more likely to find themselves, potentially having that, purchasing that item. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I hope that's come across okay, that certainly not placing any blame on victim by any means, just talking about, human perception and the cueing, and whether that might even play in that, awful area of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, along those lines, maybe something I just wanted to point out as well is that one of the studies I've done on trustworthiness was based on the fact that even though I'm interested in biological features, at the same time, our social lives as humans, we are ultimately, profoundly social beings, and we've developed into the species we are because we are highly social as well. And that means that we mustn't forget that aspect. So coming back, for example, to trustworthiness or dominance, I've been running a series of experiments now to try and determine how quickly we pick up on dominance through interaction. So now this is the same photograph of the same individual, and some of the participants are going to play a computer game with this person thinking it's a real person. And on half of the trials, this person will be a lot better than the participant. And on the other half, they'll be a lot worse. So it's the same face, but sometimes it's a person who's going to end up being perceived as a lot better than you or a lot worse than you. In a separate series of experiments, the same type of task, but it was a trustworthiness game where you had to share amounts of money with the other individual. Now, the result of this, I thought that the biological features would be processed really rapidly. Again, coming back to the beginning of our discussion about the amygdala and these rapid processing networks that seem to occur without awareness, I was expecting that, as far as dominance and trustworthiness are concerned, that when you learn about it, it would be the cortex, it would be later processes that are learned, as opposed to the biological ones that you get the first impression, the facial impression. And so far, I've been surprised because it hasn't been the case, in the sense that if you take just a neutral-looking face and you get a person to interact with that supposed other individual, when they spot that person is dominant or is trustworthy, you're going to start having the same type of rapid response when they see that face. So, in other words, it looks like when we learn that someone is trustworthiness, the response is just as efficient, is just as strong as when you're just basing your judgment on facial features. This is ongoing research. I'm not 100% sure that it's the case, but in a way, I thought, well, actually, maybe it's not surprising, because again, we are social beings, and it's not just about what the person looks like, of course. It's about how we're going to interact, and very rapidly, we're going to start picking up on someone independently of their face. You're going to start picking up on, through interaction, on whether that person is trustworthiness, and your brain's going to respond really quickly to that.
Almost has an overriding affect where initially, I mean, this is where, obviously racism, sexism, ageism, all those things come from in many ways. We have an initial response that, occurs automatically, and hopefully through, education and being, a reasonable human being, you can have a conversation and actually go beyond the label, the characterization, and go, in actual fact, they're a nice human being. It's kind of like those studies when they put those kids, Palestinian kids with Jewish kids and they're best friends, and it all goes away. But you separate them, and they cry at separation because they've lost a heartfelt friend, and then years later, that's all eroded, and they have a bit of hatred towards one another, at least in some studies, and but we want to override that. So there's an adaptability there. What are the implications? And I apologize for asking maybe a bit of a naive question, but what are the implications for your findings and your studies? How do we use this really important research, or how does it help us? I've only just started thinking about this, so I'm hoping to understand some more. How do we use this information, or how does it assist us in maybe suspending our gut feelings at times, because I imagine my gut feelings are wrong quite often. And at the same time, maybe I need to actually allow them to express themselves at other times if my risk profile is higher.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's true that at this point, I still feel that we're in the process of trying to figure out how things work, and in that sense, it's still perhaps early days as to how we can then really use that. But I think it's already providing some pointers on things. And again, the example that we just mentioned now, that we just spoke about, this incident, is I think pretty demonstrative. It's the fact that we can check that lots of stuff that goes on, lots of our responses in everyday life are based on stereotypes. And what we're seeing, again, from the example, the experiment that I mentioned just before, is that these are at least very very flexible, and we can modify this through interactions. I think it's highlighting again the fact that's often forgotten, that it's important to learn, and to learn very early on in life, why those stereotypes are not applicable. I think I can give you just one other example, which is not my research, but research that has been done by other colleagues on what they've called the other race effect. It's the brain response to photographs of people from one's own race or another race. And what we see is, when you look at a photo, this is results that have been published, when you look at a photo of someone who is the same ethnic origin as yourself, you get a certain response. If you look at a face from another ethnic group, the typical early response to the face is going to be diminished if you haven't been in contact with this other ethnic group, if you're not used to seeing those faces. So, and this was carried out, I think, on a group of Asian students in Scotland. So they essentially compared the response of a group of Asian students to Caucasian faces. And what they did was they compared the response of these students to Caucasian faces when they had just come to the UK versus when they had been there for a long time. And the end result that I find interesting is that over time, this result normalize. It becomes similar across ethnic groups. So you need to interact. You need to interact a lot, and it's through interaction that your brain response is going to be modified. More fundamentally, I think what's happening is that the brain is actually computing an average. The more different events you're faced with, the more different faces you see, your brain is constantly computing and averaging. It's creating an average as a moving average kind of situation. And I think that in a way for me is progress, because I think that means that if we want to go beyond stereotypes, it's about mixing people up, typically in social situations. It's about avoiding at all costs ghettoization, for example. But again, that's, I think, things for the future.
It's very fascinating, because I remember growing up, having a Serbian heritage, and my parents migrating with my brother and I, and as we know, former Yugoslavia went through some terrible wars, and as a young man, and maybe this was reinforced by my parents, but Croatians were the enemy, right? And we all know, if we grew up here in that region, probably even these days at school, Serbians versus Croatians type of scenario, right?
Yeah.
And there's plenty of examples like that. But I was convinced. Well, I remember I used to look around and I used to think that I could visually see the difference between a Serbian and a Croatian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, clearly, plenty of confirmation bias, because you'd learn about it and so on. But clearly, they were the exact same human beings because they came from the exact same,
Yes.
heritage and that region that everyone shared their offspring and so on.
Yeah.
But it's funny how that was overriding
Yeah.
potential trustworthiness and all this other stuff. So I had, strong schema. And obviously over time, thankfully you grow out of, adolescence and trying to beat your chest and so on. You don't need to survive anymore. But also, in observing, parents who, connect and have friends that are, Croatian and, from other places in the region, that softens as well. And so all of a sudden, trustworthiness is got nothing to do with these objective ideas that maybe we return back to what you're talking about, which is, there's not a natural processes that are occurring, that micro expressions or, that hopefully flatten the curve. They average it out a bit more, and we see people as humans rather than a category.
Exactly.
Even the category of old versus young, or male versus female. That ultimate category. Humans.
Absolutely.
Wow. There's so much to learn. I imagine your biggest struggle is finding, where do I find all the resources to do the volume of research that I want to do to take this space further. Now, are there many people around the world doing this like you are?
Well, it's not a very, very large community, but there's a substantial number of researchers working in the field. And there's some really good researchers in that area, good things going on. As you say, it's often about getting funding for it and being able to go forward, because often in the absence of any clear use for this, in immediate use, apparent use for this type of research, it becomes a bit more difficult to get it funded. Even though I think, the more I'm in this field, the more I realize that this is probably a prerequisite to things that I can sense are going to be important in the future. How we perceive others, how we perceive other ethnic groups, etc., etc.
I can see so many applications, especially going to the world of, artificial intelligence and robotics, where we're going to be trying to relate with these people and or entities, these machines, and the great importance that we place on, a connection, but also, cultural differences. When someone's in a nursing home, why wouldn't we tailor a particular way that this person might perceive the world, because maybe they're of a different ethnicity or a different background. Maybe they've had every different life story, whether someone lived rurally or if they've lived in town. There's great implication, and I don't know, maybe I'm biased because I think all research should be funded, because I think it all has incredible value. And I know that, the academic life is a hard one, because you're kind of saying, pick me, I matter. This is a topic that has real, life utility, which, I'm sure it does. But it's harder to sell that story at the moment, because people can't see it tangibly, but I'm sure it's coming. On that basis, can I maybe also just ask you to maybe tell people, our listeners, about if anyone wants to get involved. I know that you're at UQ, how they can get in touch, or, where they can go to find out more information, or maybe where your publications are,
Yeah.
accessible. Maybe you can tell our listeners then now.
Yeah, absolutely. Luckily, being at UQ, I've got a website, so people can look for my name on the UQ website. There's my email. I'm happy to take any emails from anyone who's interested in knowing more about this field, or who's interested in participating in studies and so on. And otherwise, there's also a list of my publications on the UQ website that can be uploaded, I think. I'm not mistaken.
Fantastic.
I believe the list of publications is there, and I can leave you a few links as well if anyone's interested.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And do you know the UQ website off the top of your head?
Yeah, so if you it's on the UQ website. It's www.uq.edu.au.
Fantastic.
And and then you can look for my name, and there's details there.
And just look up Associate Professor Alan Pegna. That's Pegna for those listening. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Extremely fascinating, and I know these biases are occurring all the time. That's what fascinates me so much. It's very easy for us to see confirmation bias, but to see these other confirmation biases that are happening in the background is so important, because it tells us we've got to be more and more mindful, cognizant, to try and override many of our natural processes, particularly living in the modern world. And we know, for example, that people who are more attractive to our eye get treated differently, and as human beings, I think we all want to avoid that. We want to go out and say, in actual fact, I want to go out of my way to treat my fellow human being irrespective of what they look like. And we're all going to age, right? So I'm probably not going to look as handsome rooster as I do today. For any length of time, probably only my wife would say that, and that's probably fading as well. But we're all going to age, and obviously I'm well past my expiry date from that perspective. But it's interesting, we want human beings to sometimes go with their gut, because there is evolutionary value, and other times to go out and say, if I've got time, I should actually try and pull back, or if I don't have time, maybe I can think about it ahead of time. So maybe I'm, less racist, sexist, ageist, whateverist, that I, can't pull the wool over my eyes as easily. So I think this conversation is so important, because it really speaks to how we process information without knowing it.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. That's it. Spot on. No, thank you very much again for getting the occasion to meet up with you and have this conversation. It's really interesting, even for me, because obviously I'm working in the field and I'm, looking at the details every day. And it's nice to be able also to take a step back and look at the whole picture and the different things I've been doing. So it's also useful for me to have this conversation. Kind of sets up the stage again that I tend to forget.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of these niched places that have got people like yourself who are completely obsessed with this stuff, which is exactly what we need, right? They get lost because there's no audience, there's no one to talk to about this and say, hey, this is so exciting and fascinating and interesting, and and it needs an obsession around it. And that's why I love your story at the very beginning, where, you were on your trajectory in life, and then all of a sudden, one little smile that got a smile back that shouldn't have had a smile back,
Exactly.
just completely, creates a new trajectory, explosion of ideas, and
Yeah.
that's we need people like more people like yourself. So thank you for your contributions and thank you for your time
Thank you.
today. And
Thank you.
also if your research continues down its exciting path, you're more than welcome to come back onto the show to talk to
Thank
our
you.
listeners about the latest and greatest and
With pleasure.
applications. So thanks again.
That would be with pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.